The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, You're not an atheist, you're an agnostic. I can feel a lot of you grinning or grimacing or putting your heads on your desk because you're aware that this comes up over and over and over again in conversations. I know I've heard it from Ray Comfort, I've heard it from a number of different debate opponents who are desperate to try to redefine things. I thought I'd take a few minutes today to talk about this, in part because it comes up from apologists, but also because it is worth acknowledging that within the broad secular community, and maybe that label's not sufficient either, there's not complete agreement about what the terms mean or where the barriers are. There's not the same understanding about belief and knowledge. There's not the same understanding about absolute certainty. Does atheism mean I am not convinced a God exists? Does it mean I lack belief in a God? Does it mean I do not believe? Does it mean I believe there are no gods? Whatever are we going to do? I got an email just this week from a gentleman who identified as Jewish who wrote in to say, basically, I don't know how you guys can be absolutely certain that a God doesn't exist. And when I pointed out that absolute certainty isn't part of the definition of atheist, and that I don't accept that absolute certainty is possible in any context, he went on to sermonize about how he went with the dictionary definition for atheist. Now, I've read a lot of dictionary definitions for atheist because this subject comes up a lot and people love to point at the dictionary. Quick aside, dictionaries are not authorities on what words mean. They are descriptive and they describe how words are used. And so the dictionary can, in fact, get things wrong, or it can list non-standard usages, and it could not perhaps be aware of contextual usages, or who gets to say what atheist means. Is it a Christian? Do they get to define what a true atheist is? Or maybe the people who are using the label are free to point out how they use it. So I wrote back and asked the individual, hey, show me a dictionary definition that matches your description, and I will answer your question, because I suspect I'm wasting my time. And he, of course, came back with, dictionary, a link to dictionary.com, which doesn't say anything about being absolutely certain that no God exists. The discussion about labels continues, and it happens within our community all the time. I want to be clear at the outset. I'm not here today to say, this is the one true usage of the word atheism, or any other words along those lines. I'm here to talk about potential different usages, which ones I prefer, and why. Because if the goal is clarity and communication, it would be nice if we had a shared understanding of how words are being used, and that requires some understanding of the subjects underneath the surface of whether or not you believe. So the gentleman who emailed to tell me that I wasn't an atheist, or that atheism is necessarily the position of absolute certainty that there are no gods, yeah, he may have demonstrated that he didn't understand belief, he didn't understand knowledge, he didn't understand absolute certainty, he didn't understand propositional logic, and many other things that he potentially didn't understand. But mostly what he did was he demonstrated that he had no interest in actually understanding my position. He was just trying to score a point. He needed to feel superior in his position, and rather than offering any defense for the God that he believes in, he decides it's absolutely absurd for anybody to claim that they're absolutely certain about the position that a God doesn't exist. And so, since he's convinced, perhaps absolutely certain, that a God exists, then the people who don't share his beliefs must also be absolutely certain, and this is an absurdity, and it's up to him to point it out, and it makes him feel so much more confident in his position, but it doesn't get us anywhere. If you're in a position where you're having a discussion with someone, and the discussion is about whether or not a God exists, and what are your views on this subject, if their response is to say, oh, well, you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic, and they stick with that error even after you try to explain how that's not necessarily the case, You are engaged with someone who is not interested in arguing honestly. They're not interested in understanding your position at all. What they're saying is going to tell you a whole lot about them and absolutely nothing about you, and nothing at all about whether or not their position is reasonable, whether they've offered anything to justify it, or whether or not your position is reasonable. Now, labels are important because they are tools, like every other word. They don't have an intrinsic meaning, they have usages. And their value comes in if you and I share a similar, very similar understanding of how this word is to be used, then we can communicate, and we can communicate effectively. A friend of mine was in town this week to give a lecture to the atheist community of Austin, and she spoke quite a good deal about what atheism is. And in her talk, she rolled ideas of secular humanism up under the atheism label. And what she did makes sense in the context of what she's talking about. Now, I wholeheartedly reject this particular bundling, because if you want to talk about secular humanism, and I do, and I will, just not during this video so much, there's already a label for it, secular humanism. If you just take all the things that are under the label of secular humanism and make them a part of atheism, you're not so much talking about the sole label atheism, you are talking about a structure. And even in the language in which she talks about it, this context, she's talking about how we live our lives. Okay, you don't believe in God, now what? And under that context, I'm perfectly fine with describing this package of potential ideas that may be a part of most atheists' lives. But atheism also has other usages, some of which are academic, some of which I would argue are not useful at all or not accurately describing what's the case. So, I've used examples in the past of courtrooms and gumballs. I'm going to let people go out and explore those on their own. And I just want to focus on the labels, because the first question is, holy cow, what label actually applies to me? And the answer may be whatever label you want to use, provided that the person you're talking to understands what you mean when you use that label. Now, atheism gets subdivided into weak and strong atheism, or hard and soft atheism, depending on who you're talking to. Because there is a recognizable difference between I do not believe X and I believe X is false. Those two things are different. The courtroom analogy of I'm not convinced that the person is guilty is different from I am convinced the person is innocent. It has to do with which proposition one is affirming or rejecting. There needs to be a label for people who are convinced that a God exists. Generally, theist is the label that's used for that. And we don't spend a lot of time arguing about theist. I mean, somebody says you're a theist, okay, we'll talk about what kind of theist you might be. You know, are you a Christian, a Catholic, a Mormon, a Presbyterian, a Scientologist? Well, maybe they're not exactly theists. But that's getting down to specific subcategories. The top level theist, someone who believes that a God exists. This is where some confusion comes in. Because what do you call someone who does not believe that a God exists? I call them atheists. That's the label I use for myself. I think it applies. You could make an argument that non-theist is just as accurate and perhaps even better, depending on the context you're talking. A theist is someone who believes that a God exists. A non-theist is someone who does not believe that a God exists. And that allows you to take the atheist label and use it as an atheist is someone who believes no gods exist. But then you'd need a label for somebody who believes that a God... Oh, wait, we already have that label. It's theist. So there's the idea that theist and atheist are positive affirmations of opposite conclusions. Theists affirm that some God exists, and atheists affirm that no gods exist. There's no middle ground between I believe and I do not believe, but there's plenty of middle ground between I believe A and I believe not A. I don't want this to get too abstract and confusing, but at the end of the day, what I'm saying when I say I'm an atheist is that I am not convinced that a God exists. I might also be convinced that no gods exist, but at a minimum, I am not convinced that a God exists. There are people who will argue that atheism means lack of a belief in a God. I don't particularly like that one. I've used it in the past. I've stopped using it because lack of belief implies that you're missing something in a negative, kind of almost pejorative connotation. You know, like I lack money. I lack patience. So it carries with us this implication that theism is something to strive for and that you are lacking it. So I don't really like the lack. But on a technical front, I'm okay with it. If you say, I'm an atheist, and that means I lack a belief in a God, I understand that that means that you do not believe that a God exists. There's also the question of, does atheism mean a rejection of the claim that a God exists? I think it is better described as a rejection that the claim that a God exists has been established as true. I'm rejecting the assertion that this is true. That does not mean I'm accepting that it is false. In the same way that, you know, I have a $100 bill in my wallet. You can reject that it's true without being convinced that it's false. Maybe you're in this position where you need more information. Oh, but that's the middle ground. That's agnosticism. You're admitting there's a middle ground between belief and disbelief when you've just said that there wasn't. No, that's not the case. So what's the deal with agnosticism? Agnosticism. What are we going to do about that? Well, first of all, it's not particularly relevant to a belief claim. Now, there are people who view this as theists claim a God exists, atheists claim no God exists, and agnostics are the middle ground. Because there would be a middle ground between claim A and claim not A, and that is to reject both claims. There either is a God or there's not. There's no middle ground between whether there's a God or not. But what you believe about those two propositions makes up a middle ground. So maybe that's where agnosticism lives. The problem is that going back to the root of the word, and again, when I'm talking about usage, I'm not saying that there's only one right way to do it. I'm talking about why I use what I use, and I think once it's understood, it is more precise and it's better. Belief is the question. Do you believe that a God exists? Do you not believe that a God exists? Do you believe that no gods exist? Knowledge is a subset of belief, and so Gnosticism and agnosticism, because the words come from the root related to knowledge, and theism and atheism come from a foundation of belief, that would make them not mutually exclusive, and agnosticism wouldn't be a good label for the middle ground between some God exists and no gods exist, or the belief about that. Agnosticism has a history of saying, those people who are claiming that a God exists and those people who are claiming that no gods exist, neither of them have demonstrated their claim. Neither of them can demonstrate their claim. Not only is the question not answered, but it's unanswerable. It's unknowable. And so I have this intellectually superior position of not being committed to either of those. The particular group of agnostics that are trying to make that claim don't seem to recognize that if the question is, do you believe that God exists, saying I don't know, either means that you don't know whether or not you believe, which seems bizarre and doesn't match up to the position, or you're not answering the question. If I say, do you believe I have $100 in my wallet? And you say, I don't know. Are you saying you don't know that whether you believe or whether you don't believe? You're probably answering a different question. You're probably answering the question, do I have $100 in my wallet? But the fact of that is separate from what your belief about it is. I either have $100 in my wallet or I don't. And what you believe about it is you are either convinced that I do, you're convinced that I'm not, or you're not convinced of either. This is one of the reasons why when we get to the precision of these things, nontheism as a label may have really strong value. It's just that it doesn't have any popularity or history. And atheism as a label, if I take atheism to be equivalent of non-theism, I am not a theist. I'm an atheist. Now I have a label that has a good history with it. The problem is that the history includes multiple usages. You can pick up any number of books on atheism and find somebody saying atheism is the position that there are no gods, or they'll use some other language like atheism is the view that gods are fictional or that gods are not real. And there's subtleties in each of the questions that are being asked. And that's why there are so many different usages. And somebody can email and say, atheism is absolute certainty that no gods exist. Okay, while there's some flexibility in the usage and modern usage, I don't really find that anybody's making a reasonable case that the only or the most significant or proper usage of atheism is to be equivalent to an assertion that that I'm absolutely certain that there are no gods. What's a sandwich? There's a whole bunch of people that just cringe because this is a fun topic which came up at Aposticon over and over again. We try to come up with a definition for sandwich, and then you figure out what fits into it. Does it need to be between two pieces of bread? Is it, just an open-faced sandwich? Because that's only one piece of bread. If you fold that in half, is it still a sandwich? If an open-faced sandwich is a sandwich and you fold it in half and it's a sandwich because now it's actually wrapped around it, how is that functionally different from a taco where you have whatever your filling is between two pieces of bread or folded around by one piece of bread when a taco shell is a form of bread, soft taco or hard taco, is fried crisp. Does it require a leavened bread? This was a lot of fun to discuss, and it wasn't too big of a deal. But it's a perfect analogy to what's going on with labels like atheism. And one thing I wanted to get across was something I spoke to my friend about the other day, and that is, here's a sentence: I am an atheist. We might spend days talking about that atheist label, but there's 3 other words in that sentence. And curiously, they seem to have a meaning. They seem to have a usage that nobody argues about. I mean, okay, we'll set aside, Bill Clinton saying it depends on what is, or depends on what is means. That sentence, we understand those words. And I'm not saying that atheists necessarily has or should have a usage that is as clear as I or am and. The point of that is to say we clearly do have some words for which there's virtually no ambiguity. But if you said, I'm going to have a sandwich, there wouldn't be any discussion about what a sandwich was. It would just be understood, you're going to eat this sort of thing. If you started defining sandwich as the stuff that you put in between two pieces of bread and the potato chips that go with it, well, the potato chips aren't the sandwich. They're not. It may be the most normal thing in the world. Maybe 95% of the places you go where you order some kind of sandwich, you're going to get potato chips. That might go along there just hand in hand, but that doesn't mean that the potato chips are part of the sandwich, which is why I have some objection to rolling secular humanism or skepticism or any of these other isms up under the atheism label. Because one of the problems with labels is that the broader they get and the more potential positions that they reflect, the less useful they are if our goal is to clearly communicate what we mean. I had a conversation 2 or so years ago with Neil deGrasse Tyson after Aposticon. He'd made a video that kind of disparaged the atheist label, and he wasn't going to use it. And I probably called him a douche or something on the TV show and went up to talk to him and apologize for the name calling and have a discussion about it. A lot of people think that, he's going to avoid the atheist label because it might affect his popularity or, TV deals. That's not the case, and that's not what I anticipated the case would be. Neil expressed that his concern was about clarity in communication. And if the majority of the world uses the atheist label in a way that does not fit him as a non-theist, as a non-theist person, well, then he's not going to use the label because it's too clunky and confusing. And I understand that. But the question came up of, first of all, who gets to define what atheist means? Who gets to popularize their version of the usage? I don't get to, if suddenly atheists outnumber Christians, that doesn't mean that how atheists use the term Christian suddenly defines what a true Christian is. I'm a proponent of the people who are adopting a label to apply to themselves. They get to declare what that label is. Language moves around. And in the same way that good can mean bad in the right context and bad can mean good in the right context, playing with language is a good thing. It's what we do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the time to play with language is when you're talking about ideas, if you're effectively trying to communicate. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a scientist and an astrophysicist. What if the rest of the world started seriously abusing the terms scientist and astrophysicist such that they no longer reflect what Neil does? Does that mean he should give up those labels as well? Or is it more of a good thing for him to fight for those labels, to say, hang on a minute, I appreciate the fact that words don't have an intrinsic meaning, and when you say scientist, you could mean peanut butter if you want to, but there is this long history of this, and there's a history of people who fit this label, and if it's going to morph, those people should have priority in the popular usage, because let's say scientist suddenly changes its common usage such that scientist now means book. Well, now you can't say I'm a scientist because people are going to look at you funny because it is morphed into the equivalent of book. So we need a new label for it. I'm fine with that, except that it shouldn't be necessary. If there's already a perfectly good label, or a label that's close enough, a label that has a tradition and a history, then you should use it. At the end of the day, the label is secondary. If you're in a debate or a discussion with someone and you're spending all of your time talking about whether or not you should identify as an atheist or a non-theist or an agnostic or a hard theist or a super theist or an anti-theist or a super anti-theist, agnostic, skeptic, humanist, you're no longer having a conversation about something with content and context. This is about what my position is exactly the same no matter what label I put on it. And if we're not going to talk about what my actual position is and instead spend all this time talking about what I should call that position, I'm not sure we're doing a good job of having a conversation. Having a discussion about labels might be important. But if I'm in a world where people are claiming that a supernatural agent created everything and loves them, and that they are assured that this is actually true and that they could not possibly be wrong, what difference does it make what I call myself? I'm saying I do not accept that. I am not convinced that those propositions are true. I do not believe it. And if their response is to say, you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic, okay, how does that change whether or not I believe your position, whether or not you've made your burden of proof, whether or not your position is at all reasonable? It hasn't. And if instead of defending why someone should believe your claims, you've spent your time talking about what they should call their disbelief, well, you can set the red herring down and get back on track of defending what you actually believe. At the end of the day, you get to label yourself whatever you want. I have some preferred usages. I tend to use the word atheist as an equivalent for non-theist because it's popular, because I think it fits, because I think we can clarify from there. You believe a God exists? I would identify you as a theist. You can use whatever label you want. If you don't believe that a God exists, if you are unconvinced that a God exists, I identify that as an atheist. You can use whatever label you want. And the two of us could sit down and have a conversation together and say, okay, here's the position. What label do we want to put on it for the purposes of this discussion? That shouldn't be necessary. It can be done, but it shouldn't be necessary. And the reason that it feels necessary sometimes is because it's so much easier to pretend that the person you're talking to doesn't have an understanding of the right labels and the right language and the right understanding of these things. Because then you don't have to spend any time at all defending what you actually believe. I actually do not believe that gods exist. My defense of that is based on their inability to demonstrate, those people who are believing the claim, their inability to demonstrate that this is actually true. Where's the evidence? Where's the argument? Labels are important in the sense that they allow us to communicate and hopefully communicate effectively, but only if we have a shared understanding. When the labels get in the way, throw them away. Because at the end of the day, there's either a God or there's not. And if you're convinced that it's true, and I'm not convinced that it's true, whether I'm convinced it's not true is a secondary issue. Going back to the courtroom analogy that I've used over and over again, the defendant is in fact guilty or innocent. We put the burden of proof on the claim that the defendant's guilty because innocence may not be able to be demonstrated at all. It may be an unfalsifiable proposition, depending on the nature of the case. But whether or not God exists, I can be convinced that God exists, not convinced that God exists. Convinced that God doesn't exist, not convinced that God doesn't exist. The reason we lean towards demanding that the theists establish and meet their burden of proof is because they are making a positive claim. For those atheists, or anti-theists, or strong atheists, depending on what label you want to put on it, who make the positive claim that no gods exist, they have adopted a burden of proof as well. The interesting thing is that if you fail to show that gods don't exist, that doesn't mean that they do. And if you fail to show that gods do exist, that doesn't mean that they don't. But what we have demonstrated is that until such time as the positive claim that a God exists meets its burden of proof, belief in that claim shouldn't be warranted. And the label you put on that is entirely up to you. I'm sticking with atheist.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.